Okay, we'll get started. Hello and welcome to Restoring the Future, from net zero to nature positive. My name is Rijn and I'm the Director of Commercial Development at Greening Australia. I have the pleasure of moderating this important webinar today, what it means to be nature positive and why we need to strive for more than net zero. Before we begin, I'd like to sincerely acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across this country and pay my respects to their elders and leaders, past and present, and those emerging. I'm speaking to you today from Kaurna country, and I acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional owners of this land. And I also extend an acknowledgement and welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us on the webinar today. We have guests dialing in from all around Australia, so I invite you all to introduce yourselves in the chat box and acknowledge the country from where you're joining. Please select the to everyone option, so when you're posting, we can all see your messages. In this webinar today, I will get back to my notes. My apologies. In this webinar today, we'll be exploring what it means to be nature positive and why we need to strive for more than net zero. We'll be unpacking the scientific and investment levers required to go beyond damage mitigation, so our economic activities can not only minimize impact, but also enhance ecosystems. To discuss this topic, we have three special guests with us today on our panel. Dr. Adrian Ward, CEO of Accounting for Nature, Nadine Mueller, Executive Director of Global Commodities for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, Nick Mogford, Executive Manager, Strategy, Innovation and Business Development for Bush Heritage Australia. We'll be running Q&A with our panelists toward the end of the event, so I invite you to use the chat box to post any questions throughout the discussion, and we'll get to as many of those as we can in the last 15 minutes. And before we dive into the topic with our panelists, I'd like to set the context for today's discussion. A global goal for nature, in parallel with the UN Climate Convention's net zero emissions goal, would commit governments and companies to be nature positive by 2030, taking urgent action to halt nature loss now. We need to halt and reverse nature loss, measured from a baseline of 2020, through increasing the health, abundance, diversity and resilience of species, populations and ecosystems, so that by 2030, nature is visibly and measurably on the path of recovery. By 2050, nature must be repaired so that thriving ecosystems and nature-based solutions continue to support the economies of future generations, the diversity of life, and play a critical role in halting runaway climate change and biodiversity loss. Greening Australia launched this year our Valuing Nature, Climate Action and the Economy White Paper. The white paper, available online, and a link will be sent after the event, was a collaboration of 9 industry leaders from AstraZeneca to Ernst & Young, who are experts in the relatedness of the economy, our ecology and community. This white paper has enduring value for today's topic. Now, I'd like to take a moment to quote from it. The economic benefits of climate and biodiversity action must become more measurable. That means using the right science-based metrics to assess the success of a restoration project or environmental investment. To get capital into this game, all players in the climate space need to focus on creating products, as merchant bankers might do, to develop discrete, understandable, and valuable environmental initiatives that can be packaged for investment. Proper valuation ensures capital, whether that's private or public, can flow into projects that heal ecosystems. To that end, Greening Australia believes that ambitious solutions which authentically protect people, nature, and the economy need to be incentivised, bringing Australia into step with global trends where nature positive is the new net zero. Today, we hope to explore a range of key topics, including integrity at scale, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, the long-term development transition to nature positive, patience, preventing greenwashing, co-benefits versus core benefits, market-based and non-market-based mechanisms, and the need to balance all these interrelated issues and more. So let's get into it. We are privileged to have Adrian, Nadine, and Nick joining us today to reflect on this topic, from net zero to nature positive. Welcome all. Dear panel, thank you for joining us. We'll start with you, Adrian. Recently, there's been excellent coverage of the need for environmental accounting and the work of Accounting for Nature. AFN's director and former Treasury Secretary, Ken Henry, said this week, this is a game changer. There is intense interest from the financial markets to see this information if it can be commercialised in the form of a biodiversity credit. What role does Accounting for Nature play in our transition to a nature-positive economy?
Thanks, Jay. Great to be here and coming from Wongarabara country here in Queensland. We're on a very wet first day of December. For Queensland, it's absolutely hammering down rain and it's 20 degrees, so it doesn't feel quite right. But anyway, yes, so Ken launched the Burnett Mary Regional Scale Environmental Account a few weeks ago in Margaret River at the NRM conference. I suppose the game changer is that we have got first sort of somewhat high level assessment at the multiple catchment scale, 5.6 million hectares of the condition of native vegetation, fauna, and river condition, also aquatic vertebrae. And I think what's really interesting is it sort of sets the first, I guess, assessment at that scale to drill down and really understand where nature risk and opportunities might be, which is the intention of that particular environmental account. So Accounting for Nature doesn't only work, of course, at the regional scale. Those are the big scale screening assessment type methods that we use, but we also work at the property scale and project scale, where a number of companies that we work with are using Accounting for Nature to verify environmental benefits associated with carbon projects, ACCUs and whatnot, and selling them for price premiums and access to market and all that sort of stuff. So the role Accounting for Nature can play across scales is, and you said it before, there is integrity at scale. That's particularly the case with the Burnett Mary Regional account, and obviously the application to TNFD, which I know we're going to talk about a lot more, and as a first sort of pass before you then drill down and you do much finer scale environmental accounting to really prove outcomes on the ground in terms of environment, and then, as you said, monetize them. So Accounting for Nature is working across those spectrum to bring science-based methodologies to market that we can use for a range of purposes, but also maintain the integrity depending on the scale that and the purpose you're using those environmental accounts for.
Thanks, Adrian. And to quote, I'm sure, some executive or some CEO somewhere that has once said and gets mentioned in every management book we've ever read, what's not measured can't be managed. Is that a reasonable heuristic to view your work through as we try and get to a nature positive future?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if we look at markets, you need to know where your profit and your loss and your revenue and expenses and your asset values and liabilities are all trending, because you can't make decisions otherwise. So why would it be any different with the environment? Fantastic.
Well, Adrian, given that you just said a whole bunch of words around accounting, profit and loss, money and markets, maybe it's a good opportunity to pass to you, Nadine. You've just returned from COP27. Welcome back home. Where at COP, there was an entire day that was dedicated to biodiversity. What was your main takeaway from the biodiversity and nature conversation at COP27, and how do you see that translating into the Australian context?
Thanks so much, Jay, and thanks to the panel for having me today. Great to be with you. Wow, yeah, I've just come back from COP. Well, I've been a week in Australia and still digesting what went on. There's so much to discuss. I think it was one of the biggest COPs that we've seen to date. 35,000 people all talking about sustainability, the environment, and obviously the transition. And that word keeps popping up everywhere now. And that is because we are in a transition. I've moved to Australia 3 years ago, and the change that I've seen just through the lens of corporates that we engage with as CBA, obviously, is phenomenal, and it's great to see. So being on the ground at COP in Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh was fascinating. And to have a whole day around biodiversity, which hasn't happened to date, that said a lot. I know Adrian mentioned TNFD, and I think that had something to do with it. last year at COP26, they talked about biodiversity, nature-based solutions, but we're still very early days. People didn't really understand, what does nature positive mean? Why do I need to invest in nature-based solutions? Or how do I even do that? Is it scalable? That's, for us at CBA, we always want a marker that is scalable. And why do we need it? Now, in Australia, we're very fortunate to have nature-based solutions, to have land, a lot of land access, and I'm sure we'll hear more from the other panel members around that. But what the premise of COP was really to go into the details of what does TNFD mean for biodiversity? How do we anticipate what is the change that is coming and needs to happen, and how does nature-based solutions, how do we get to 1.5 degrees? How does that help further the transition? So a lot of big topics, a lot of very high-level conversations to begin with, but it was the first COP where biodiversity has actually been written into the COP27 text, and that was a real big step in the right direction, in my opinion.
Thanks, Nadine. Why do you think now in 2022 at that COP there was that level of attention? Because the term nature positive is both new but old. It was first, I believe, surfaced around 2020 as a key concept that has to happen. So why has it taken 2 years for us to now be at a place where the global carbon market has had a lot of activity in vegetation projects, and there is that inherent link between carbon sequestration and biodiversity, restoration or conservation? Why now?
Really good question. Answer is twofold. I think you mentioned it in your intro, core benefits versus co-benefits. I think a lot of companies, when they first started engaging in markets, carbon markets, or anything to do with offsetting, they didn't really understand what are the different types of projects out there. They just went to a broker, they engaged with our broker, and they got sold some types of credits. Whereas now there is that sophistication that's emerging that we're seeing. There is a lot more focused on, I don't want to say high quality credits because I tend to stay away from that term, but differentiation. So we're talking about those core benefits that you've said. What is this project doing for the community? What is it doing for the nature? What is it doing for other potential benefits that come with it? And we do see that obviously stratification in price that has emerged over the last year, which has shown that, we do have that demand for carbon credits that meet that criteria. And then the other part of it is now you see a bigger focus on carbon removals. So previously it was avoidance credits that, people were buying the majority of, that had something to do with, that was very much price driven. Whereas now, I think if you're sitting in a corporate business and there is, you're an ASX listed company, you have shareholders, you have the media, you're very conscious of what you're purchasing. So again, that's another driver.
Thanks, Nadine. Really good summary. I hope there are people in the audience that have experienced a lot of those factors, and I hope there are people who this is new to them, because that was a really good summary to connect those dots, which brings us, quite conveniently to yourself, Nick, in terms of in your experience and with Bush Heritage, what are the key ingredients and practical examples that you see create effective, scalable nature-based solutions that will tackle the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss simultaneously?
Yeah, thanks, Jay, and great to be here. Great to be joining from Boon Wurrung country, just south of the Melbourne CBD. And I think the key in your question there is scale. I think it's been estimated that $10 trillion a year is needed globally for the next 10 years to solve for the solutions of climate and biodiversity. So if that was a country, that would be the third biggest country in the world. So scale is important, and we probably do need that lens for the impact that we're working on. And there's no doubt that carbon and biodiversity together, solutions that provide those outcomes simultaneously can be a really powerful part of that. we're of the view that if carbon projects that are optimized for carbon can also be optimized for biodiversity, that's a great outcome for biodiversity. So there are some great examples there. In terms of the 3 ingredients, I'll take a leaf out of Gordon Ramsay's book and stick with 3. So I'd go with balance, integrity, and storytelling. So I think you mentioned balance yourself earlier. It's going to be really important to get the money tangibly flowing to the right areas, the right solutions, the right projects to build that momentum and trust. And a couple of examples there. One is actually we do need to be careful that we're not putting all our eggs in the carbon plus biodiversity basket, because there will be some biodiversity needs there that are less or not related to carbon. So it's important to make sure that how this complex system comes together, the money's flowing to the right areas and we're getting the right outcomes. Another one on balance is just getting the right balance within projects. We're an organisation very focused on land-based outcomes. So if we don't get dirt under our nails for a few days, we start to get a bit twitchy. Probably you're the same yourself, but within projects, we really want to make sure that the money's flowing through to the land and the landholders. So biodiverse plantings are happening, practices that deliver strong performance against residual ground cover targets at the end of the dry season in agriculture, initiatives that are driving rehydration. We really want to see the funds going to these events. Yes, we need monitoring. Yes, we need accreditation. We need a few lawyers. We need a few accountants, but we really want to get the balance right there. So that's balance. Integrity is well covered, so I won't labour the point, but and I think Nadine spoke to it really well just now as well. But it will be important to drive that scale that we're after. And that's why things like the Chubb Review are great, to really make sure that we're maintaining that integrity. I think a good mindset to have is above what we need to do, what could we be doing? So it's great to see digital mapping coming into carbon projects on large scale projects as an example. It's great to see robust methods being used to assess biodiversity improvements, flora and fauna. And from a social point of view, it's great to see that expectation that the projects are having a great community impact and within that traditional owner engagement. So projects that go well above what's the minimum requirement for eligible interest holder consent, I think will be increasingly valued, which is great and will drive that scale. I think storytelling is really important. We're very much a science-based organisation, but we recognise the real importance for storytelling. My kids often tell me that to keep it real, Dad, and I think it's going to be an important part of this growth to make sure we're celebrating what we're actually after. But that plays a really important awareness and education piece as well. Biodiversity is going to be harder to define than carbon, and people are going to have to make their choices in biodiversity as to what they're after. Is it broad scale vegetation improvement, or is it more around species threats? There will be choices that need to be made. So I think storytelling, celebrating the return of a totem species to a landscape, the last piece in a jigsaw puzzle for reconnecting fragmented landscapes in really important biodiversity hotspots, 2,000-year-old coolabah trees in semi-arid areas. I think we really do need to be complementing the science with storytelling. So those would be my ingredients.
Thanks, Nick. That's wonderful. There's so much in there, and to the point on storytelling, something that I often say a lot is, let's not let the truth get in the way of a good story. But I think that falls down here. We need the truth. It is all about the truth. And this is that distinction between a co-benefit, which is something that we acknowledge, hey, it's great. Listen to the complexity in what you just outlined there, Nick. Like, there is nothing simple about what you said there to deliver a good project at scale even. And we could talk about the co-benefits associated with that. And that's cool. But how do we know that there's truth behind those claims? And that's, for me, where we start moving into core benefits and quantifying that, yes, there is a improvement of habitat condition or threatened species return or social inclusion or social outcome that we can measure on a scale that's independent, that's verified, that has rigor, that it's not just someone's very good marketing department that's in charge of it, it's actually someone's head of science that's in charge of it. which I think is a nice segue to recently the work that Accounting for Nature, Adrian and your peers have done with Green Collar and the launch of the Nature Plus credit. So how does that relate to this conversation, and how do organisations, businesses, governments use biodiversity as that ecological and economic risk tool and mitigation strategy when investing in nature-based solutions to have that through line to truth around the real biodiversity outcome here?
Yeah, well, I'll just go into storytelling just for a moment. I think it's fairly simple. You just don't overclaim. You know, you tell the truth. You don't get a scientist to tell the truth, because, no, I shouldn't say that. They probably tell a very good story, but you know, you still need very good storytellers. But obviously, tell the truth. Don't overclaim. Don't make all the false and misrepresenting things that the ACCC says you can't do and all that sort of stuff, and you'll probably be fine. And often the truth is a very compelling story anyway, especially when it's backed up by evidence. Now, going on to Nature Plus. So there's really interesting developments in this whole environmental market space. And, you know, originally Accounting for Nature was we're very cautious about backing issuance of nature, standalone nature credits. Simple as that, because it's very new. There's a lack of international governance and systems and whatnot to actually issue these things. Thankfully, there's some really good work being done by World Economic Forum and others to actually help guide integrity and principles around nature-based credits. But it's still very early days, and it's come a lot faster than we expected. We were sort of pushing out saying, well, it's going to be 3 to 5 years before someone comes to market with something really, you know, integral and but no, it's happening a lot faster. It's not just in Australia, it's internationally. So there is a real race on to generate or issue these types of credits, and apparently there's huge demand, and maybe Nadine can talk to that from the corporate side. Still very keen to know what it looks like, but look, I think it is really important, and if we look at Australia in particular, there's vast areas of the continent that carbon projects are just not suited for, because there's just not enough carbon and they just fall over on the economics. So if you can create something around the improvement of nature without the carbon sort of benefit of it, climate benefit, then absolutely, I think it's something worth exploring, as long as we stick to the science, integrity at scale, do great storytelling at truth, all that sort of stuff. And I think above all, we're transparent around what these products are when they're put out into the market and what the buyer's actually buying. Because as we know, we're not just buying tons of carbon dioxide equivalent here or ACCUs or whatever. We're buying potentially a lot more different things that are way more complex to tell a story about. So it's a really interesting space, but I think it's well needed, particularly if you look at WA and vast areas that are covered by Indigenous protected areas that we need more money to manage. It's a very high potential for revenue to support those types of projects. So we'll see how this space goes.
Thanks, Adrian. There's something that occurred to me there as you were talking. I think it was in respect to some of the governance around these things. And I think we all can acknowledge that we need to have this, you know, fact-based, evidence-based, effectively industry now emergent to say, yep, this happened for these reasons, and we can stand behind the data effectively. Interested though in your view about regulated and unregulated markets per se. So we can use the carbon market as a bit of a reference here. We've got here locally, Australian carbon credit units are a regulated,
financial product.
Financial product, carbon credit. But you know, it's regulated because it sits very much under the auspices of the Australian government and the various, you know, regulatory bodies that sit around it and administer it. You know, versus say the gold standard or Vera as international units that are voluntary units that really beyond really the Paris Agreement don't have any formal regulation per se. So keen to, and probably it's probably a really good kind of conversation for you and Nadine to kind of to have here about how does regulated, non-regulated, and how these things sort of shake out now moving forward for nature.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And look, people say, well, just refer to the carbon playbook on how we develop these markets for nature. And yeah, there's some important lessons and some huge things we need to resolve around additionality and permanence and all the usual stuff that we had to solve for carbon markets for a couple of decades, which we have to solve a lot quicker for nature, I suspect. Otherwise, we're going to end up with a real mash of greenwashing and really bad products out there and then it'll just confuse the market and blow up everything that we work so hard for. You know, having said that, I think, you know, is it a regulated market? I think government can certainly play a huge role in setting frameworks and rules around best practice and all that sort of stuff. And ASIC and ACCC and others can play a huge role as well around making claims, and that sort of forms into shape. I think there's still a long way away from actually government issuing ACCU maybe. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what happens with the federal government biodiversity market. It's also really important to note that in the early days of the carbon markets, we had CDM and other units, and they're pretty boring, to be honest. Like, yeah, they were good, but the real innovation came out of Vera and Gold Standard, particularly in the biodiversity and the landscape sort of space. So I think there's a place for both, and I might handball this over to Nadine now, because she'll be probably much more up to date on where all that stuff is at now from a corporate sort of demand side perspective in particular.
Really enjoying the discussion. There are a lot of keywords here that certainly Nick and Adrian, you've thrown out. You know, integrity, transparency, and I probably say standardization is one that I think we need to be careful of. If you have a fragmented market, a incredibly difficult market to understand, you won't see bias purchasing the units that you spend so much time on developing and trying to get it right. So a big part that the role that CBA is trying to play is to demystify the market, is, you know, these are the units available and these are the standards they adhere to. Now, the Australian carbon market has had a lot of false starts over the years, and you guys have definitely worked on them a lot longer than I have, certainly in Australia. But you mentioned the CDM, and those were my early days. I started in Europe in 2008, and that was sort of my first, you know, interaction with, you know, this is how international projects work. But in Australia, you have a government-led market, so there is that, you have that integrity piece, or you should have it. Now, hopefully, we'll get some clarity around the integrity and from the Chubb review, which will, you know, be finalised in December, because then we really have to get going. We have to develop new products. We've seen a lot of technology products that are coming out, like direct air capture, biochar. We need more innovation and nature-based solutions. Blue carbon projects are great. Soil carbon projects, we need more of that, and we need it at scale. And we can only get there. People will only invest in nature-based solutions if they understand the integrity, the transparency, standardization, and I've said this on many panels, so Jay, you might have heard this. We can't ask for certainty, we won't get it, but what we need is pragmatic certainty. We need to understand the rules of the road. We need to understand what is the definition of a high quality carbon credit. So this is where all of these task forces that have emerged over the last couple of years are incredibly important, because core carbon principles are coming out. And that's that first step to really understanding, okay, these are carbon credits that I can purchase that, you know, I personally won't be held accountable in the public eye for the wrong reasons. We don't want that. And once we have that, we can then hone in. And that's when you see a lot of the private equity firms. That's when you see the super funds coming in. That's when you see private capital or nature capital flowing into this space. And that's what we needed to scale. We've already seen a lot of our clients asking of us about nature-based solutions, specifically soil carbon, blue carbon credits. We've seen, you know, environmental planting is a huge one, obviously, Jay. And that's because they know TNFD is coming. They've heard about, you know, the stewardship for biodiversity. And everyone's sort of trying to understand what I need to do to comply with those mechanisms. So that's the policy angle. But then from a how do I meet my net zero target? there is that understanding that, you know, we want to do something, and we have the ability to do something in Australia around nature-based solution and becoming nature positive. So that understanding is increasing every day. And we have companies coming to us on a weekly basis now saying, what projects do you have in this space? Or can we invest into projects directly with yourself, which is obviously even better. That shows commitment. And I think we'll see more of that as we get more clarity from the regulator in Australia, but also from the task forces offshore, so core carbon principles.
Thanks, Nadine. There's, I think, again, if we consider our audience today, there will be everyone who is very deep into this work, and there's a lot of technical stuff here that's going to be resonating, and potentially others who are just getting into this and wanting to explore more. And again, what I think we all know, and certainly what I'm hearing on this conversation, is just the level of complexity that is here, all the things that need to be looked into in real detail, and the number of stakeholders that need to be lined up to get to where we need to be. Often I hear, biodiversity, it's so complex because, how do you say that protecting the eastern quoll over there versus the numbat over here, how do you say one's better than the other? Adrian, could you just try and simplify that for us in this audience about, I'm sure you don't have the magic solution, but I'm sure you've got a way to simplify this for us.
Well, Accounting for Nature as a company puts in place the methods to measure whether, there's more quolls or more koalas or whatever. And then at the end of the day, it's up to the community or the buyer to decide what they prefer to buy. So, when we work with the likes of Green Collar and any other carbon aggregators, their buyers have different preferences, and certainly not up to us to say you should buy a quoll versus a koala versus a budgerigar or whatever. That is totally up to them. And it really connects with, as Nick said before, the storytelling aspect. So what story do you want to tell? It's often based on what material, how material those species are or ecosystems are to your potential business or property or whatever. So there's a whole bunch of reasons. So there is certainly no simple answer on what to buy. And that is one other challenge, because it's not like for like CO2 is, although CO2 with nature now is a bit different. But, it is a complex question, but it is also a very subjective question in many respects from the buyer side. It's certainly my perspective anyway.
And Adrian, just to make you swap hats for a minute, take your CEO hat off, put your head of marketing hat on. Would you say that this is completely resolvable though? It is resolvable to say that we can classify that an improvement in biodiversity condition has occurred, environmental or ecological condition has occurred. It is a measurable change from the baseline where it was to later, and that is absolutely something we should invest in.
Yeah, the delta, effectively. As long as you can attribute it, and this is another complexity, you attribute it back to the action that you put in place, and we also know that you can't just plant stuff and assume you get an outcome because of fires and floods and climate change and other annoying things that get in the way that actually might change nature instead of you. And you don't know that until you, filter those things out and make sure that what you're doing is what the reason is. And I guess that's where the additionality component comes in and all those other things that do make this complex. But yeah, from a marketing perspective, absolutely, it is resolvable, it's packageable, and then it's about the buyer being aware to what they're buying and putting in their, the right amount of due diligence to decide what's the right product for them at the end of the day.
Thanks, Adrian. Nick, I might go to you about, where do you see the challenges here in, what do we need to overcome, barriers we need to bust to get in front of this?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot, and I think inertia is probably one that's on that list, to be perfectly honest. We definitely do need to keep moving forward. I think Adrian said it earlier, we need to be really clear and upfront and transparent about what the level of confidence and risk is as we do that. But we do need some pilots, and we do need to start moving so that we know enough to solve the next problem and unearth the problem. The one that Adrian just mentioned there in terms of attribution, dynamic reference is a solution there. Now that's not going to be easy to implement in all circumstances, but it is a solution to that problem. I don't think we know how we're going to do that at scale at the moment, but the more we get into that and the more that we see how close does that need to be, how the more confidence we'll get in solving that problem. Yeah, look, there are a couple of examples, but I think moving forward and having pilots and understanding the problems and solving them real time as we go is going to be a really important part of all of this.
I think we've canvassed a bit of the challenge and complexity. I might just make an observation as well that there might be people on the other side of our screens who are going, well, we're just talking about trees, aren't we? Or we're just talking about bush coming back, and how hard can it be? And I think absolutely, that's a really good question. In fact, I think it's incumbent on all of us to explain. It's hard, but it's achievable. And I think a very, very, very simple analogy is there's nothing more simple than water, which you probably can't. Oh, it's a bit magic in the way that the backgrounds work, but there's nothing more simple than water. Apparently, it's free. It falls from the sky occasionally. Regularly on the East Coast, it's falling far too much. But to get that water into my glass, to put it into my body, which I need desperately, is not easy. And I'm sure we can all imagine the various hands that milliliter of water is touched, and the amount of money and infrastructure and safety standards and accountants and lawyers and the value chain associated from getting that water from that cloud into that glass is significant. This is not that different putting nature back. It takes a lot to put a tree in the ground because you need the right soil at the right time, with the right place, with the right person, with the right dollar, with the right fence, with the right legal structure, with the right investor at the right scale, at the right time. And I think it's incumbent upon us to really educate the potential investors, participants, donors out there, not to wave their flag and say, oh, woe is me, this is so hard, please support us, but to really help them understand the challenges inherent so that they come on that journey with practitioners, understand the risks and the rewards, and can be closer to this. And perhaps we find other analogues in things that get produced in our economy that we go, hey, you know what? Conservation is kind of similar to like producing that bushel of wheat over there. What lessons can we draw from that and bring over? So to the group, what other challenges do you think that we face here that we need to be overcoming?
Well, I think I agree with Nick. Examples and open examples on how to do this. I think access to capital to kickstart these projects in the first place is often really hard to overcome because catch-22, hawk before the cart sort of stuff. You need money to plant trees, and then you want to get money at the other end on a performance basis or what have you. So that's a tricky one. Simplifying the complexity on doing these projects is really important too. I think we work with a lot of land care farmers and others, and they're all super keen to do carbon projects to get carbon revenue and stuff. But when you drill down to it, it's actually incredibly hard to put projects together without a carbon offset developer and then into the realm of legals and all that sort of stuff. Is it worth it? Still probably is, but there's sort of tends to be sometimes a bit of a lack of trust around that, getting a third party involved and signing your land away and all those sorts of issues that go along with it. So it is challenging to get, I guess your average farmer, landholder, family farmer, they're getting engaged in these markets. And often they're doing so much, and they have done so much great work over the generations. They want to be rewarded for that fact as well. So it is challenging in that respect.
I was just going to say, to add on to your point, I think just thinking about from a CBA perspective, and it is incredibly difficult for, especially people in risk to fully understand the risk of, developing a project. We're bankers. For us, it's numbers, it's science. When you add, a bushfire, when you add floods, and all sorts of other things that you've mentioned to the equation, it becomes very difficult to quantify that. And that is something we have to overcome in order to reach this scale, because capital is around. We know that companies want to invest in nature-based solutions, but it's that understanding of the complexity of a project. How does it actually get off the ground? And to your point, Jay, it's not just planting a tree in the ground and you receive an ACCU or some type of form of other carbon credit. It's not as simple as that. And I think that barrier to entry is extremely high in Australia, and we need to lower it so that more people can invest into carbon projects or nature-based projects. But there needs to be this understanding of almost like a roadmap of here are your risks. They tend to be the same for, all of the 10 different projects that you have. But here are a few that differ. And then this is, when you talk about permanence period, 25 years or 100 years, again, to invest in a project that long, there are risks, is that farmer going to be around? Australia, bushfires is obviously a huge problem. So we need to address that in order to reach the scale. And then the other thing that I think about is a lot of our clients need some form of accreditation. So while there is new concepts and new products being designed, a lot of them will look towards, organizations such as Climate Active and say, we want their approval, we want the Climate Active stamp. So if it doesn't fall under that, it's like computer says, no, I don't know if I can use this towards my net zero commitment. So that's the other, it's not an issue, but it's a question. It's something that the market needs to address so that companies feel comfortable. It's buyers be aware, but that's, some of the thinking that we're hearing.
Thanks, Nadine. What you said there about reducing barriers to investment, I think applies, if I heard you correctly, applies both to the supply and the demand side. We need to reduce barriers to invest for those to generate supply and reduce barriers for those who want to invest on the demand side and want to invest, so that we bring this closer together. Fully agree with that. And like any good story, if that's something that we're going to really orient around today, I think we've just gone through a bit of the dramatic part of the story where it's a bit edgy and a bit uncomfortable, and we can now start to come out the other side where there is the hope and the optimism, because this is getting done. We are doing these things, and I'd like to go around the room and ask for an example of where you see this working well, and in so doing, how do we scale that's already working well? Nick, I'll start with you.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So I guess if you and I couldn't come up with an example here, we'd be in trouble with the organisations we work in. But a bit self-serving, but earlier in the year, Bush Heritage was successful in extending its reserve network. We made a lovely little acquisition down in the Fitzsterling region of southwest WA. It's a great property. It adds to the jigsaw of reconnection in that globally recognised biodiversity hotspot. So big tip for connectivity and some of the outcomes that we're looking for there around habitat for Carnaby cockatoo and everything. It's just a great opportunity. It has remnant vegetation across a third of it, but 2/3 of it offer a great opportunity for biodiverse restoration, and really enjoying those conversations with you around how we could maybe collaborate on it. So I think it's just a great opportunity of how markets are starting to recognise these opportunities. It's a great opportunity for us as an organisation and our supporters. It's a great outcome for nature. Socially, as we always do, we'll be connecting very closely with the community and the traditional owners, and our early conversations. I think also it can be a great model for how NGOs can collaborate on these great opportunities as well. So that would be my example for you, Jay.
Thank you, Nick. Look, you're on the supply side. I'll go to the demand side. Nadine, where do you find hope and optimism here?
Just speaking to our clients on a daily basis on the demand side, all we're hearing is, what can we do in terms of biodiversity and nature-based solutions, and how can we get involved in projects day one, which is very good. That's something a year ago I wouldn't have heard. Yep. And on the supply side for us, speaking to companies like yourself, and how can we put capital at risk, and how can we engage with, organisations such as Adrian's, Nick's and Jay Greening Australia, how can we get involved and develop projects that then we know we have the demand on the other side. Maybe not organisations that want to get involved in projects because their demand is slightly smaller, but so that we can tackle both sides of the equation and get involved.
Fantastic. And Adrian, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I'd do a shout out about Gunicum Pastoral Company up near Monto in Queensland. It's 11,000 hectare grazing property. They sell their beef into London, actually, from a sustainability, regenerative, labelling capacity. And I suppose I want to just flag that, nature markets or natural capital, or whatever you want to call it, these sorts of new environmental markets that we're seeing doesn't have to be confined to units that are issued and sold. We can get, greeniums on products, as they're apparently becoming to know. Also, really importantly, maintaining access to market. I think if you look at particularly Europe, there's some really major disclosure laws coming in around sustainability reporting, particularly also on product labeling and things like that. So, there's a pathway to monetize that actually that is available now to a lot of landholders in the first instance before they maybe jump to carbon nature credits and things, which is a bit easy to get into on their own behalf. So don't just think about unitisation. There's plenty of things you can do as a producer to tap into this new, wave of demand for sustainability or regenerative products and services, or whatever it is that you're selling.
Yeah, we also can't lose sight of important philanthropic inputs into this area as well, which have and are and will be a really important feed in, and also great research that's coming through in terms of the productive benefit from good condition natural capital as well, pollination, ground cover, rehydration benefits. So I think there'll be multiple paths to these outcomes that should give us great cause for optimism. Yeah.
Wonderful, and we're getting close to time of our event today, which gives us a great opportunity to go through some questions from the audience. So, just having a look through some of the questions that have come through, and I'd like, given we spoke about COP27 at the top with Nadine's presence there, we have a question from Karen, which is to all the panel. Karen's interested to understand what you think are the big ticket items from COP15 upcoming next week. So the COP15 UN biodiversity talks, which will be kicking off in less than a week. What are you expecting to hear? What do you think is going to be the big announceables at that forum?
I'm the only one not on mute, so I think the discussion around TNFD is probably one that I'll be looking really closely. That's really getting some momentum up. We're really interested in it, and I think it'll drive a lot of activity. The one for me is that there does appear to be a lot of Control C, Control V on carbon, and I think where that's appropriate, that's a good thing. But there are some differences, and I think the coverage of some of those differences is something I'll be looking at closely.
I would probably add the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. It'll be interesting to see, I guess, in its draft version as it comes through and gets debated. So that's important because in combination with a bunch of other things, TNFD, but also the work done by the International Sustainability Standards Board on a global baseline, is one of the real key ingredients that we need if we're going to have a biodiversity unitised market in the future like we've got for carbon. So at the moment, we do have that missing piece. We don't have like Paris targets for biodiversity that have really been bedded down yet at a level that's useful nationally and as subnational. So that's probably a big thing I'm keen to follow in combination with the TNFD and all that sort of stuff around nature risk disclosure.
I agree with both of them. I think TNFD is probably the biggest announceable and what that contains, because if you say TNFD to a lot of organisations, they know it's coming, but they don't really have the understanding to go into the detail of what does that actually mean. And that was very similar to TCFD, which everyone's very familiar right now, but it took a while. So I think COP15 will largely focus on that and the definitions and what does that actually mean for disclosure documents? How do they have to be framed? And what's the capital required?
Which is a really good segue, thank you, Nadine, to a question from Georgina. Georgina asks, will it get to a place soon where biodiversity targets are communicated and understood as widely as net zero? What will it take to get there?
Wow, yes, we hope so, I would think. We need to. What does it take to get there? Gosh, a lot of bracketed text and everything that we've gone through with UNFCCC, I expect. But hopefully we expedite it a lot faster. I think, again, there's a lot of challenges, keep saying this, around measurement and what you measure and materiality and all those things that need to be resolved. So it's likely to be a bit of a slow process, but I'm sure we will get there. Don't know when though.
I agree with you, Adrian, but I'd also say if we rush into this too quickly, we're going to have some market that's trying to relate to carbon markets. It's going to be a little bit of, it's going to be too complex. We need to take it in bite size. Let's understand what that means. What do the targets look like? I agree with everyone. I think there will be, eventually companies will report on biodiversity targets and they'll need to. I think that will come out of TNFD. But what that looks like, I don't think we'll get an agreement. Having been to COP27, I've sat in the negotiations. I'd be very impressed if there are a lot of announceables coming out. Just purely, the negotiations take time, and it's not as simple as a few nations agreeing on things. Everyone's got their own agenda. Everyone wants to table what they think is important to them. So no doubt this will be a very complex discussion again.
And it'll take a week just to settle on the agenda, I'm sure, as these things go.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's I now understand why it takes 2 weeks to agree 14 words after having been top. It is incredibly difficult, and I have a lot of respect for the negotiators themselves who sit there every morning at 6 a.m. until 4:30 in the morning just to negotiate a comma in an agreement.
Anything to add there, Nick?
Oh, just to concur, I think we don't have the benefit of a ton of carbon metrics. So you've got two pastoral stations that are 100 kilometres apart, and you get very material variations in how you should be looking at what's on those stations, and that's in the same sector in a very close proximity. You start to talk about these metrics going globally across sectors. It's a complex space, and we need to help it happen, but be realistic as to what is achievable through the process, and celebrate the little steps on the way through, I think.
But I think we can take I take your points, Nadine, about we need to be cautious about trying to replicate the carbon infrastructure, say, and policies and all those things into this. So I take your point there. I also acknowledge that there is significant accelerating upside to the fact that, yes, it took so long to get anything said and done about the Paris Agreement and Article 6, but that was the government's worrying about that comma in that sentence. The corporates, when TCFD came on the agenda and net zero, that there was a material risk to their profit because of climate change, corporates started moving straight away. So I think the whole market really felt that wave of interest come into nature-based solutions for carbon due to TCFD. And you've said already, Nadine, TNFD should have a similar cascading impact on the demand side. So I think maybe hopefully we find perhaps a better balance this time between, we all probably waited too long for something to happen out of the Paris Agreement from the government level, and then TCFD came along and we got things moving. Maybe we're here going, hey, these two things can operate together to kind of help us move forward, because as we mentioned at the top of the call, we have to act now. So this is not we've got 10 years to think about it. It's we need to act today now to halt the removal and destruction of ecosystem services, such that by 2030, which is only 8 years away, and in the environment, that means 8 seasons. So that there's only, 3 months to a productive growing season. So we've got 8 seasons to see a measurable improvement based on stopping today. So we got to start now. So I think there's this balance we come back to about fast and slow. And Adrian, I can see you chomping at the bit, please.
Well, I mean, they've been saying the decade of climate and the decade on climate and all that stuff, and still we're struggling. I think the other, I mean, from a market perspective and what really spurs this stuff on, there's 2 other things here, obviously, is pricing in the risk of biodiversity loss. Or 3 other things, actually, that's one, and reputational risk and whatnot. The other one is fiduciary duties on directors. So at the moment, you've got to disclose climate risk. Soon will be nature risk. That's probably not that far away from APRA and others, possibly. And the third thing, which I've totally forgotten, actually. Oh, no. Greenwashing, of course, as well. So, and just ACCC regulation in particular on making false and misleading claims. And no one really wants to be caught up in what's happened with the carbon market. Said I wouldn't mention it, but I will, just because I have to make that point. And I think there is certainly a lot of the corporates we work with now don't want to say something without making sure that what's right. So they're going to spur all this sort of stuff on, basically.
And I think we're seeing that already. And I think, again, it's part of the celebration of progress. Yep, there's a lot of, to get common metrics that can be applied globally or regionally, that there's a lot of work and complexity to work through there. But the amount that we're seeing happening now, authentic understanding of natural capital across agricultural land, how can we steward that? What role does it play for production? What role does it play for conservation? It's just really exciting. So we can walk and chew gum on this.
Nice. We're getting to close, and it's been a wonderful conversation. We've got one more question that we can cover today from the audience, and I really like this question from Ella because it speaks to a part of the conversation that we've referenced today, but we haven't yet explored. And Ella's question is, do we think there is more we could be doing to measure the community impacts of credit generating projects? For example, local employment or working with traditional owner groups to help people consider their value beyond strictly scientific figures. So really, this is a social impact, core outcome, core benefit, social impact question.
Yes, is the answer for me.
Yes. And that goes back to measurement. And I think that's Adrian's point. It's how do you measure it? We need ways to measure things, not just, the 1 ton of carbon is 1 ton of carbon, but what are the core benefits and what are the co-benefits associated with the project? I think we're doing that already, but we need to do a better job.
And a yes from me as well. It's a big part of everything that we do. We challenge ourselves on the measurement and reporting on it, and we haven't nailed it yet. And I don't know if anyone has, but it's a great opportunity and definitely should be on the agenda.
Because and I agree. So I think that's we all agree that the work needs to be done. It needs to be done fast there as well. So that's fantastic. So that one's a quick and easy one. So we get a bonus question, and this one, because we've got a minute or 2 left, it's just come straight out of the chat and goes from Matthew for you, Nadine. From a demand side, what investment metrics or measures does CBA and others prioritise when deciding to invest in a carbon or nature project?
Wow. Probably need more than 2 minutes for that answer, but there are a lot of different variables that go into that from a risk perspective, going into the climate risks, going into who is the landholder, where is the land, do we bank that landholder? And there are a lot of other metrics that I can't speak to right now, but it is a lengthy discussion. And as I said, we're fairly new to this. We've been in carbon markets for a long time, but this is investing in projects. This is something that we want to do. We have done. We just did the first prepay transaction in Australia where we prepaid for carbon credits that are going to be generated in a few years' time. So we are trying to do more, but it is really understanding what that risk looks like and reducing the barriers to entry.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you, Adrian, Nadine, Nick, for sharing your insights. We covered a lot of ground today. I hope that the audience can hear it coherent to the audience on the other side. And please, if you have any feedback, send it through to our team. They'll be posting a note in the chat shortly. It's clear that we need to provide nature-based solutions of high integrity at scale. The journey to net zero and nature positive requires science, due diligence, risk management, and patience. We know when we need to get to net zero and nature positive, and I really do look forward to seeing how we get there. So thank you all on the panel today. Thank you all for joining on the other side of the screen. And as I said, if you'd like to provide any feedback on this event or connect with a member of our team or this panel, we'll be putting in some information into the chat soon. So thank you all for your time.
Thanks, everyone.